The wind whispered through the pines, a cold, slow ghost telling secrets to the dead needles on the forest floor. Snow was falling, soft as a final breath, blanketing the hard ground near Blessing Creek. This was a place where fences were sparse, but judgment was thick as thieves. And in the middle of a small clearing, as the light began to fail, a girl's face blinked against the swirling white. Her lips were the color of a deep bruise. Frost clung to her eyelashes, each one a tiny frozen needle. Only her head was visible. The rest of her was underground. The dirt was packed hard around her throat, dark and wet where the snow was melting against her skin. She wasn't crying. She'd done all her crying the night before, when her own father had shoved her into the hole he'd dug. He'd called it justice. He'd called her a curse. A woman who couldn't bring a child into the world, he'd snarled, had no right walking on top of it. Burying her, he'd said, might just make the Lord pay attention, might make the soil fertile again. Her name was High Renfield, and she hadn't said a word. She'd learned a long time ago that answers didn't save you. They only gave men like her father more words to twist into a weapon. Time had stretched and warped into something monstrous. The sun was a pale, shivering disk that crawled across the sky. Crows circled overhead, their black shapes stark against the gray clouds. She saw them, the townsfolk. They passed by on the path not 50 yards away. They saw her, too. And they looked away. The preacher on his fine bay gelding rode right past. He didn't even slow down. The barkeep's wife paused for a moment, just long enough to clamp a hand over her child's eyes and hurry them along. Even the town sheriff, a man sworn to uphold the law, had just shaken his head, muttered something about family matters, and trotted his horse on down the road. Nobody stopped. Nobody helped. She was a bad seed being returned to the earth, and in Blessing Creek, that was a kind of holy work. I thought about snowflakes. Her mother, before she'd passed, used to say that every single one was different, a unique little miracle. But looking up at the sky, at the endless, cold, white flakes landing on her face, Hai decided her mother was wrong. They were all the same, blank, cruel, and relentless. She'd given up. She'd closed her eyes, ready for the cold to take her, ready for the world to finally go dark. That's when she heard the hooves. They were slow, not hurried, measured. She didn't bother to look. It was probably her father, coming back to see if his judgment had been carried out. But the horse stopped. Then another, and a third. Footsteps crunched in the snow. Heavy boots. Smaller ones, too. A child's voice, soft and trembling, cut through the wind. "Papa, there's a lady in the dirt." Hai forced her eyes open. The light was a painful, searing thing. She could make out shapes through the blur, 4 small figures, and one that towered over them, a giant of a man silhouetted against the dying day. The giant knelt beside her. He didn't laugh. He didn't spit. He didn't have a gun in his hand. He just looked at her. His eyes were dark, and they held a strange kind of quiet. He wore a heavy fur-lined coat, and he reached out with a leather-gloved hand, gently brushing the snow from her forehead. He didn't ask what she'd done. He didn't ask why she was there. All he said was, "You still breathing?" She managed a nod. It was barely a twitch, but it was enough. He nodded back, just once. Then he pulled off his gloves, tucked them into his belt, and began to dig. He didn't use a shovel. He used his bare hands. He watched as the frozen earth flew. His hands were huge, calloused and blistered, but they moved with a strange sort of care, like he was uncovering a fragile relic, not just digging a girl out of a premature grave. His coat fell open as he worked, and she saw a chest crisscrossed with old, faded scars. She saw the intricate beadwork of his people stitched into the lining of his vest. She tried to say thank you, but her throat was frozen shut. Only a dry, rasping sound came out. A little girl, no older than 6, with wide, curious eyes, crept closer. She held out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. "I'm Clover," she whispered. "You can have my biscuit. We already ate." Hai looked into the child's eyes. They were brown and warm, like chestnuts. There was no fear in them, no judgment, just a simple, profound offering. The dirt finally started to give way. Her shoulder broke free, then an arm. The man worked without stopping, his breathing coming in steady, rhythmic puffs of white in the cold air. He dug until the earth released its grip on her ribs, until she finally slumped forward, falling out of the hole and into his arms like a bundle of withered roots. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. He cradled her against his chest, so gently she thought she might be dreaming. She could feel the steady, powerful thrum of his heartbeat against her ear. It was the first human warmth she had felt in what seemed like a lifetime. The children gathered around, silent and watchful. 2 boys, one with dark hair braided down his back, another with a mischievous glint in his eye. A second girl who had a missing front tooth clutched a thick wool blanket. They started walking away from the clearing toward the town, and nobody stopped them. They walked right past the general store. The shopkeeper, Mr. Abernathy, was sweeping his porch. He saw the giant of a man carrying the half-dead girl from the Renfield farm. He met the man's eyes for a moment. Then Abernathy spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "You'll regret taking that in, Red Elk," he called out. "Some soil ain't meant to grow again." The man, Silas Red Elk, didn't answer. He just adjusted Hai's weight in his arms and kept walking, his children trailing behind him like a small, loyal flock. They passed the church. The bell was silent. They passed her own farm. She saw her father's mule staring dumbly through the fence slats. Amos Renfield was nowhere to be seen. Drunk in a ditch or hiding in his house. Maybe both. It didn't matter. Still, nobody stopped them. Hai drifted in and out of a cold, black fog. When she finally opened her eyes for good, she was in a different world. She lay in a small, rough-hewn wooden cabin. Firelight danced on the ceiling beams, casting a warm, golden glow on everything. A thick quilt, heavy and smelling of wood smoke, was pulled up to her chin. The air was filled with the scent of pine and baking bread. She turned her head slowly. A pot of something savory simmered on an old iron stove. Tiny coats were hung on wooden pegs by the door. She saw a child's foot sticking out from under a table, the rest of him wrapped in a buffalo hide, fast asleep. And she saw him. Silas. He was sitting in a chair near the fire, his shirt off. He was tending to a fresh scrape on his arm, humming a low, wordless tune. It sounded like a lullaby he'd learned a long, long time ago. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness and pain washed over her. Her body was a wreck of bruises and agony. He looked over at her, his dark eyes unreadable. He didn't get up. He just gave a slight nod. "You're safe," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Cabin's warm. You'll stay till you're strong." She had to ask. Her voice came out as a broken croak, like thin ice cracking under a boot. "Why?" He didn't answer her directly. He just poked the fire with an iron rod, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "Ground's no place for someone who still breathes," he said, his back to her. Then he stood up and walked toward her. He was holding something, a small, intricately carved wooden bird. He placed it on the small table beside her bed. "My wife made these," he said softly, "for luck." Hai stared at the bird. It was beautiful. But then she noticed something else, something that made the air in her lungs turn to ice. Around the bird's leg was a tiny, tied piece of string, and on that string was a single, small bead. It was a brilliant, almost unnatural blue. It was the exact same color, the exact same shape, as a bead her mother had sewn into the hem of her dress just before she died. A secret bead. A secret her mother had told her never, ever to speak of. And suddenly, this warm, safe cabin didn't feel safe at all. It felt like a trap. Who was this man? And how did he have her mother's secret? The next morning, Silas was gone before the sun came up. He'd left a bowl of warm oatmeal and a cup of weak tea by her bed. The children moved about the cabin with a practiced quiet, feeding the fire, whispering to each other. I ate with hands that shook so badly, she spilled half the oatmeal onto the quilt. She slept, and when she did, she was back in the hole. The weight of the earth on her chest, the taste of dirt in her mouth, her father's face snarling above her. She woke up with a silent scream caught in her throat. The cabin door creaked open, and Silas was there. He had a basket of firewood in one arm and a freshly caught fox slung over his shoulder. The smell of the cold, clean air rushed in with him. She couldn't stop it. The tears came, hot and silent. Her shoulders shook with sobs she'd held in for years. She hated herself for her weakness, for crying in front of this stranger. He walked right past her, setting the fox down near the stove. He didn't look at her, didn't say a word. "I'm broken," she whispered to his back, the words tasting like ash. He paused. He stood there for a long moment, then slowly turned to face her. His voice was low, but it cut through her shame like a sharp knife. "Only things strong enough to be broken," he said, "can survive being buried." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with things neither of them understood. He walked back to the fire, picked up a tin cup, filled it with warm broth from the pot on the stove, and placed it beside her bed. He didn't touch her. He just left the cup there and went back to his work. In that small cabin, nestled deep in the woods where the judgment of Blessing Creek couldn't reach, I felt the world shift on its axis. It wasn't a new world, but it felt like one. A world where a girl buried in the dirt could be seen. A world where a stranger's hands could be gentle. But as she drifted back to sleep, the image of that brilliant blue bead burned behind her eyelids. This wasn't just a rescue. She knew it in her bones. This was something else entirely, and she had a terrifying feeling that she had been brought here for a reason. The days that followed were a blur of quiet healing. High's body, a roadmap of bruises and aches, slowly began to remember what it was like to move without pain. She learned the rhythms of the small cabin. The pre-dawn hush when Silas would leave, the mid-morning chatter of the children, the smell of cedar and stew that filled the evenings. Silas never asked her about her father. He never asked her about the hole. He just left food for her, made sure the fire was always lit, and kept the world at bay. He moved with a heavy grace, a man carrying a weight he never spoke of. The children were her first bridge back to the living. Clover, the youngest, would sit by her bed and tell her stories about the animals in the woods. Ash and Mika, the twin boys, would leave her small gifts: a smooth river stone, a bird's feather, a misshapen piece of cornbread. But it was Nico, the oldest, who watched her. He was maybe 10 years old, with his father's dark, solemn eyes. He rarely spoke to her, and when he did, his questions were strange. "Do you remember the big oak tree by the creek?" he asked her one afternoon while she was trying to mend one of his shirts, her fingers still clumsy and weak. I think so," she'd stammered. "Do you remember what my mother used to call it?" He pressed, his gaze intense. She shook her head, confused. Why would she know what his mother called a tree? Nico just nodded slowly and walked away, leaving her with a cold knot of dread in her stomach. One evening, she woke from a deep sleep to the sound of hushed voices. Silas and Nico were talking near the fire, their words barely audible over the crackling flames. "Are you sure she's the one?" Nico's voice was sharp with doubt. "She doesn't remember Papa? She doesn't remember anything?" "She will." Silas's voice was a low rumble. "Give her time. The ground took a lot from her. It's going to take time to get it back." The one for what? What was she supposed to remember? The fear was a living thing inside her now. She wasn't a guest here. She was a project. A key to a lock she didn't know existed. The next time Silas went to Blessing Creek for supplies, he came back with more than just flour and salt. He came back with a grim set to his jaw and a new tension in his shoulders. He didn't say anything to her, but that night, after the children were asleep, she found him staring into the fire, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. "What did they say in town?" she asked. her voice barely a whisper. He looked up, surprised she was awake. He hesitated, then sighed. Abernathy, at the store. He said to send you back. Said your family's land has a debt that has to be paid. A debt? I was confused. The Renfield farm was poor, but they owed no one. Her father was too proud to take a loan. What kind of debt? Silas looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. He said you know. He said your mother made a promise. Her mother. The blue bead. The memory slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. A forgotten conversation from years ago, when she was just a child. Her mother, frail and sick in bed, pressing the tiny bead into her palm. This is the key, Hira, her mother had whispered, her voice weak. Don't ever forget the pact. The land remembers. The land keeps the score. She hadn't understood then. She'd thought it was just the fever talking. But now, sitting in this stranger's cabin, it was all coming back. The pact. A deal made a generation ago between her grandmother and Silas's grandmother. A sharing of the land. A promise sealed with a secret. He thinks I know where it is, she whispered, the realization dawning on her. Silas nodded grimly. They all do. Suddenly, her father's cruelty made a terrifying new kind of sense. He hadn't buried her because she was barren. That was just the story he told the town, the story he told himself. He'd buried her to break her. He'd buried her to try and force a secret from her mind, a secret he believed she held, a secret about a hidden treasure on their worthless patch of dirt. And this man, Silas, hadn't just stumbled upon her by chance. He had been looking for her. He had been waiting. Because he was the other half of the pact. He believed in the treasure too. She looked at him, at his powerful frame, at the scars on his chest, at the quiet intensity in his eyes. He had saved her life, yes. But he wasn't just a savior. He was a man with a claim, and she was a part of it. The fragile piece of the cabin shattered. She was no longer a victim being sheltered. She was a pawn in a very old, very dangerous game. And the game, it seemed, was just getting started. The confirmation of her fears didn't wait long. It arrived on horseback, reeking of cheap whiskey and righteous fury. Her father. He didn't knock. He just threw the cabin door open, letting a blast of frigid air inside. Amos Renfield stood there, his face a blotchy red, his eyes wild and desperate. He wasn't looking at Silas. His gaze was locked on high. "You told him, didn't you?" he screamed, his voice cracking. "After everything I did for you, you ungrateful whelp. You told this savage where it's buried." Silas moved to stand between them, a silent, imposing wall of muscle and anger. "Get out of my house, Amos." But her father just laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "Your house? This is about my land, my legacy. She knows where her mother hid it. The map. She knows." High's blood ran cold. A map. The confrontation was like a key turning in a long rusted lock. A memory, sharp and vivid, exploded in her mind. She was a girl again, maybe 10 years old, hiding in the linen closet. Her mother had just died. Her father was tearing the house apart. Not in grief, but in a frenzy. Ripping open mattresses, pulling up floorboards, screaming about a promise and a cheat. He was looking for something. He kept screaming about a map hidden in the family Bible. He never found it. And his frustration and rage had curdled over the years, poisoning everything it touched. Poisoning him. He'd turned that rage on her, the only piece of her mother he had left. He hadn't buried her to make the ground fertile. He'd buried her to unearth a secret. "There is no map," Hai said, her voice shaking but clear. She stepped out from behind Silas, facing her father for the first time as something other than a frightened child. "Liar!" Amos spat, taking a step into the cabin. "Your mother was a conniving witch, and you're cut from the same cloth. She promised it to me." "She promised it to his family," Hai said, gesturing to Silas. "It was a pact, to share." Amos's face contorted with a fresh wave of fury. "Share! With them! They're nothing! They live in the dirt!" "You're the one who put me in the dirt," Hai shot back, and the power in her own voice surprised her. The force of the memory, the truth of it, had unlocked something inside her. The fear was still there, but it wasn't in control anymore. Her father stared at her, his mouth hanging open. He saw the change in her eyes. He saw that the broken, silent girl he'd tried to erase was gone. He lunged for her. Silas moved like lightning. He didn't hit him. He simply caught him by the front of his shirt, lifted him off his feet with one arm, and threw him back out the door. Amos landed in a heap in the snow, sputtering and cursing. "This ain't over!" he shrieked, scrambling to his feet. "The whole town knows what's mine! The sheriff knows! You'll see! You'll all see!" He stumbled away, a pathetic, raging figure swallowed by the twilight. Silas shut the door, the heavy bolt sliding home with a deafening thud. The cabin was silent, save for the sound of the children breathing, their wide eyes peeking out from behind a curtain. Hai turned to Silas. The air between them was electric. "Your wife," she said, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying speed. "How did she die?" Silas's jaw tightened. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He just stared at the fire. The doctor called it lung sickness. "But that's not the truth, is it?" Hai pressed, her heart pounding. He finally looked at her, and the grief in his eyes was so profound it was like looking into a grave. "No," he said, his voice thick with a pain he had clearly carried alone for years. "Your father. He believed my wife knew where the map was. She was your mother's cousin. He hounded her, threatened her, day after day. He wore her down until her spirit just gave out, until she just stopped fighting to breathe." The horror of it settled over Hai like a shroud. This wasn't just about land or a forgotten promise. This was about revenge. Silas hadn't just saved her from the cold ground. He had pulled her into his own war. He was looking for the map not for treasure, but for justice, for a reckoning. And now, her father was going to bring the whole town down on them to keep that from happening. She walked over to the small wooden bird on the table, the one Silas had given her. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the carved feathers. She looked at the single, brilliant blue bead tied to its leg. "My mother," she said softly. "She told me this wasn't the key. She told me it was a sign for the one who would know where to look." Silas stared at her, his breath catching in his throat. "What are you saying?" Hai met his gaze, the last of her fear burning away like mist in the sun. "I think," she said slowly, "I know where she hid it. The town didn't wait for an invitation. They came the next day, not as a mob, but as something far more sinister, an official proceeding. The sheriff, a portly man named Gable with a drooping mustache and shifty eyes, rode up to the cabin. But he wasn't alone. Trailing behind him were Mr. Abernathy from the general store and two other grim-faced men she recognized from town. Her father, Amos, was with them, a smug, triumphant look on his face. This wasn't about a missing person anymore. This was a siege. Silas stepped onto the porch, his arms crossed over his massive chest. He looked like a mountain that had decided to grow legs and a bad attitude. "Come for the law, Gable, or just to back up this coward?" he asked, his voice a low growl. The sheriff cleared his throat, avoiding Silas's gaze. He unrolled a crumpled piece of paper. "Silas Red Elk, the town council has concerns about the Renfield property." "It's my property," Amos piped up from the back. "Concerns about a long-standing dispute," Gable continued, ignoring him. "And it's the council's opinion that this woman," he gestured vaguely at the cabin door, "is a material witness. We're here to take her into our protection." "Protection?" Silas laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You call it protection? You all stood by while he put her in the ground. You saw it. I know you did." Abernathy spoke up, his voice thin and reedy. "That was a family matter. This is a community matter. That land has a debt, Red Elk. A debt to all of us. We all have a stake in seeing it settled." Hai stepped out onto the porch, her heart pounding but her hands steady. The pieces were all there now. the town's averted eyes, the whispers, their fear. It wasn't just her father who was greedy. It was all of them. They all believed in the legend of the Renfield treasure. They'd let her father bury her, hoping it would either silence her forever or break her into revealing the map's location, a location they could then claim for the good of the community. They were all complicit. Vultures waiting for the lion to finish his kill. "There is no treasure," Hai said, her voice ringing out in the cold, still air. Every man there flinched, as if she'd slapped them. "She's lying!" Amos shrieked. "She's trying to protect him!" Hai locked eyes with the sheriff. "I know what you all did. You watched. You let him do it. You were hoping he'd do your dirty work for you." Sheriff Gable's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. He drew his pistol. "That's enough out of you. You're coming with us. Now." But as he raised the gun, a small voice piped up from the doorway. "Leave my new mama alone." It was Clover. She was standing there, all 6 years of her, clutching the edge of the doorframe. Her brothers, Ash and Mika, stood on either side of her, holding hands. Nico stood behind them, his face set in a defiant scowl. The sheriff faltered. Pointing a gun at a man was one thing. Pointing it at a man surrounded by his children was another. "This doesn't concern the children," Gable stammered. "It concerns all of us," Silas said, his voice dropping even lower. "This is my home. This is my family, and you are not welcome here." He gave them an ultimatum. Give up High by sunrise, or they would come back and burn the cabin to the ground. They called it enforcing a town ordinance. As they rode away, a cloud of threats and hatred hanging in the air, Silas bolted the door and began to barricade the windows. The cozy cabin suddenly felt like a tomb. They were trapped. That night, as the wind howled outside and the minutes ticked by toward the dreadful dawn, the children huddled together by the fire. Hai sat with them, trying to project a calm she did not feel. Silas was checking his rifle, his movements economical and deadly. The peace was gone. The war had come to their door. It was Clover who broke the silence. She padded over to Hai, her small face serious. She held out her hand. In her palm was a small worn leather pouch, the kind for carrying medicine or tobacco. "Mama told me to give this to you," she whispered, her voice so soft Hai could barely hear it. She said to only give it to the lady from the dirt." Hai's breath caught in her throat. She took the pouch. Her fingers fumbled with the drawstring. It wasn't a map inside. It wasn't a jewel. It was a key. An old iron key, heavy and rusted. And folded beneath it was a single brittle piece of paper. She carefully unfolded it. It was a deed, a legally registered, properly stamped deed. Silas's wife, years ago, long before her health had failed, had done something extraordinary. Knowing what kind of man Amos Renfield was, knowing his greed would one day boil over, she had used her own small inheritance to purchase a single, forgotten acre of land. An acre of land square in the middle of the Renfield farm. The deed was in Silas's name. The treasure wasn't gold. It wasn't jewels. It was something far more precious in that harsh, dry country. It was the only spring-fed acre on the entire property. The only piece of land that could grow crops even in the worst drought. The only thing of real, lasting value. Amos hadn't just been after a mythical map. He'd been trying to get his hands on the one part of his own land he didn't legally own. He'd buried his daughter to try and scare away the only other claimant, to nullify a deal he couldn't break with lawyers or threats. "He buried me for dirt," Hai whispered, the words catching in her throat. Silas came over, reading the deed over her shoulder. His eyes widened. A slow, grim smile spread across his face. "No," he said, his voice filled with a terrible, righteous anger. "He buried you for water. And my wife, may she rest in peace, made sure he would never have it." Outside, the first flakes of a new snow began to fall, thick and fast. A blizzard was rolling in. But Hai knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the storm wasn't the only thing coming for them. Her father and the town weren't going to wait for sunrise. The blizzard came in like a fist, a howling vortex of wind and blinding snow. It erased the world, turning the landscape into a churning, white chaos. The cabin groaned under the assault, its timbers creaking like the bones of an old man. It was a tiny island of warmth and light in a raging, frozen sea. Inside, there was no more waiting. The ultimatum had been a lie. They were coming. Silas stood by one barricaded window, rifle in his hands. Hai stood by the other, her own hands wrapped around the cold, heavy stock of the second rifle. Her fear was gone, burned away by a cold, clear rage. She thought of the hole, of the dirt in her mouth, of the town that had turned its back. She wasn't that girl anymore. The earth had taken her, and the earth had given her back. Nico, his young face a mask of grim determination, was put in charge of reloading. Ash and Mika were tasked with keeping the fire blazing, melting snow for water. Little Clover, her eyes wide but resolute, was the lookout, peering through a tiny crack in the back wall. They were a family, a clan, ready for war. They didn't have to wait long. Through the swirling snow, they saw them. Torches, a dozen of them, maybe more, bobbing like malevolent spirits in the storm. It was the sheriff, her father, and a mob of townsmen, their faces twisted by greed and the false courage of whiskey. They weren't planning on an arrest. They were planning on an erasure. A voice, distorted by the wind, bellowed out, "Red Elk! Send out the girl and we'll let the children live!" It was her father's voice. Hai's knuckles were white on the rifle stock. Silas glanced at her, a silent question in his eyes. She just nodded. The first shot wasn't theirs. A bullet splintered the wood of the cabin door, missing Silas's head by inches. And then, all hell broke loose. The next few minutes were a blur of sound and fury. The roar of the blizzard, the crack of rifles, the splintering of wood, the enraged shouts of the men outside. Silas was a master. He fired with a calm, deadly precision, not to kill, but to disable. A shot to splinter a torch handle, sending it sputtering into the snow. A shot to clip the saddlebag of a man getting too close. He was a warrior defending his home, and he was magnificent. He found a rhythm. Breathe, aim, fire. She wasn't aiming at men. She was aiming at the darkness around them, forcing them back, creating a wall of noise and lead. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a brutal, powerful recoil that felt like a heartbeat. Her heartbeat. She was alive. She was fighting back. A face appeared in the window she was guarding. It was Abernathy from the store, his eyes wide with shock and greed. He was trying to pry the barricade loose. Without thinking, she fired. The shot went wide, shattering the glass just above his head. He screamed and fell backward into the snow, scrambling away like a frightened crab. They were holding them off. They were actually holding them off. But then, a burning log, wrapped in oil-soaked rags, crashed onto the roof. The smell of smoke began to fill the cabin. They were trying to burn them out. "The roof!" Silas yelled, pointing. There was no time. The fire would catch in the dry timber, and they would be cooked alive. Hai made a decision. She looked at Silas, at the soot on his face, at the fierce love for his children burning in his eyes. She looked at the deed, still clutched in her hand. "Cover me," she said. Before he could argue, she ran to the door, slid the heavy bolt free, and threw it open. She stepped out into the storm. The wind tore at her, the snow blinding her. But she stood there, the rifle in one hand, the deed in the other. She was a ghost come back from the grave, and the sight of her froze the mob in their tracks. "Amos!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the howl of the wind. Her father was there near the front, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "You buried me for dirt!" she yelled, holding up the crumpled paper. "But my mother was smarter than you. She was stronger than you. She gave the only piece of this land that matters to the people who deserved it." She held the deed out for all to see. "This is a legal deed. To the spring. It's in Silas Red Elk's name. The sheriff has seen it. He knows it's legal." A murmur went through the mob. Men looked at the sheriff, whose face had gone pale as the snow around him. He was a co-conspirator in an attempted murder, and now he was caught in a land fraud scheme that was falling apart in front of his eyes. His authority was gone. "She's lying!" Amos shrieked, but his voice was thin, desperate. The lie was broken. He raised his shotgun, his eyes wild, aiming it directly at her heart. He never got to fire. A single shot cracked from the cabin doorway. It wasn't High's rifle. It was Silas's. Amos crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg, a dark stain spreading rapidly in the snow. Silas hadn't shot to kill. He'd shot to end the fight. It was over. The mob dissolved. Men who had been ready for murder a moment before now just wanted to be gone, to melt back into the storm and pretend they had never been there. The sheriff, seeing his whole world about to collapse, did the only thing he could. He limped over to Amos Renfield, pulled out his cuffs, and arrested him. Not for attempted murder, not for conspiracy, for assault and public endangerment. A lesser charge, but enough to save his own skin. As the last of the mob vanished into the whiteout, Silas came and stood beside her. He put his arm around her, pulling her close. The children came out, huddling around them. They stood there together, a small, battered family, watching the blizzard slowly begin to die down as her father was led away. A broken, bleeding man, defeated by a piece of paper and the ghost of a woman he could not kill. The storm was over, inside and out. They had survived. The snow stopped falling that night. By morning the sky was a brilliant, aching blue, and the world was covered in a thick, clean blanket of white. The silence was profound. The cabin was damaged, the porch scorched, the windows shattered. But it was still standing. Word travels fast in a small town, even a town buried in snow. No one came to bother them again. The story of the siege, of the deed, of High Renfield rising from her own grave to face down her father, had become instant, terrifying legend. The town's greed had been exposed, its rotten core laid bare for all to see. They wanted nothing more than to forget it ever happened. Amos Renfield was sent away to a prison downstate. The sheriff, facing a quiet investigation from the county seat, resigned his post and moved away in the dead of night. The Renfield farm, all except for one precious acre, was sold off to pay court fees. It was a quiet, brutal kind of justice. In the weeks that followed, as the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring pushed through the frozen earth, a new rhythm took hold in the cabin. It was the rhythm of rebuilding. Silas and High worked side by side, repairing the roof, mending the porch. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. Their silence was a comfortable, shared language. One afternoon, as they were splitting wood, their hands brushed as they reached for the same log. Silas stopped. He looked at her, his dark eyes full of a warmth that made her heart skip a beat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small carved wooden box. He opened it. Inside was a ring. It wasn't gold or silver. It was made of woven leather, intricately braided, with a single tiny blue bead stitched into the pattern, the same blue as the one on the bird, the same blue as the one her mother had given her. "I won't ask," he said, his voice low and steady. "A woman like you shouldn't be asked. She should choose." He held the box out to her. High looked at the ring. She looked at his strong, calloused hands, the hands that had dug her out of the earth. She looked at his face, at the man who had seen her at her most broken and had called her strong. She looked past him to where the children were playing near the creek, their laughter echoing in the clean spring air. She wasn't the girl in the dirt anymore. She wasn't a curse. She wasn't a secret keeper or a pawn in a game. She was home. She didn't say yes. She just took the ring from the box and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. That summer they didn't rebuild the old cabin. They built a new one. They built it on the single acre of land that had belonged to Silas all along. The acre with the spring. They built it together. High learned to notch logs, to mix daubing for the walls. Silas learned that she liked the windows to face the morning sun. The children planted a garden, their small hands pushing seeds into the rich, dark earth. Earth that was no longer a grave, but a promise. Sometimes storms come to tear the world apart, but sometimes they come to wash the slate clean, to sweep away the past so that something new, something tender and beautiful can finally have the space to grow. She had been buried once, lost to the world, but it was here, in the heart of a blizzard, with a warrior and his children, that she had finally, truly, come alive. Her name was High Red Elk, and her story was just beginning. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales of survival, justice, and the strange twists of fate that can change everything. You never know what secrets might be buried just beneath the surface.